Hey everyone, in today's video we are going to go over how to center items with Material UI's grid. Now, I last week released a video on grid and Material UI and I got a lot of positive feedback, but the one thing I realized I forgot to mention at the end that a lot of people pointed out in their comments was I didn't fully explain how to center things. I mostly talked about the layout. So if you're unsure about how Material UI grid works, make sure you watch that video first, and we're going to talk about centering in this video. Now, before I get started, it's worth noting that if you look at the API, the Material UI grid has three props that are used for centering. Number one is align content, align items, and also justify, which is down here. Now, if you notice, all of them have properties that are very similar to Flexbox, and the reason for that is because it is using Flexbox. Material UI's grid uses Flexbox under the hood. So if you know how to center things using Flexbox, you'll know how to center it using grid. And something I highly recommend, a learning tool that I highly recommend is called flexboxfroggy.com. I just found this today. I literally spent like 25 minutes going through the whole thing. It was surprisingly good. Someone on Stack Overflow linked to it. But I highly recommend doing this and just going through this exercise. Spend 30 minutes going through it and things will be a lot more clear to you. And just as a reminder, as usual, if you find value in this video, it really means a lot to me if you would either like the video, subscribe, or leave a comment below. It really helps the channel. It helps the YouTube algorithm get these videos out there so I could continue doing this. Now, let's jump right into it. So the Material UI documentation, if you look at the component for grid, actually has a really nice little select over here that you can play around with to help you get the idea. In this example, we have three cells. Each one of them is its own item within this grid container. Now, if we were to change the direction property, it would perform the same as it would in Flexbox. So you can see here, these are all the possible values for direction. Now, once the direction is set to row, you'll see all the items here are lined up in a row. If I change it to row reversed, it will reverse the order, but keep all the items still in a row. Now, column, what it will do is it will display all the items in a column like so, and column reverse will obviously just reverse the order of it while keeping everything in a column as well. So let's keep everything in row for now. Now, the two big properties you're going to be looking at when you look at centering is going to be called justify and align items. You'll see here that we have justify down here and align items down here, and we have align content, which could be sort of confusing because it's similar to align items, but align content only really controls the spacing between multiple rows and not the actual ordering and centering of items inside of it. So let's play around with justify. If I have justify and align items both set to center, now let's see what happens when I select justify to be flex start. Well, what it does is it moves everything so that it is at the start of this Flexbox. Now, if you're not sure what a Flexbox is, pretty much what it's saying is it will move it to the beginning of our parent container, of our grid item. That also means if I were to select flex end, well, you can pretty much guess, it will move all these items to the end of the parent container, as we can see like this. Now, let's put it back to center. If we were to do space between, well, what happens is it would center things out so we have an equal amount of space between them while pushing all the first and the last child to the very end. And if I were to do space around, well, then it would make sure that there's even spacing around every single element. It might look like there's a bit more spacing between cell 1 and cell 2 and cell 2 and cell 3, but that's just because cell 1 has its spacing up to around here, and then cell 2 also has its spacing up to around here. In fact, if I were to even inspect element and look at every single individual one over here, I guess the spacing doesn't show up as padding or anything like that, but essentially behind the scenes, that is what it is pushing for. And then finally, space evenly will make it so that it adds a bit of gutter. It makes it so that the padding from the left of the first and the last cells are the same as the one between all the ones in between. Instead of having, for example, an equal amount of padding on all sides for every single one. Now, that's what justify does. As you can see, it sort of controls the centering on the x-axis. So if we wanted to be everything to be bunched up in the complete center of the x-axis, we would use center, same for justify, and same for flex between. Now, the opposite occurs when you use align items. It centers it on the y-axis. So for example, we have center here, but if I were to select flex start, you can probably guess it'll move everything up to the top, just like that. And if I were to go to flex end, it would move everything to the end. Stretch is going to stretch everything so it takes up as much space as possible. And then baseline, I'm not too sure, but I think what baseline does is it has everything the same as flex start, but it simply just centers everything so that it is in the center of the largest item. So you can see here, cell 1 is centered in terms of cell 3, which is the largest item. So let's say, for example, we wanted all our cells to be on the bottom left of the screen. Well, what we could do then is just have our justify be flex start and our align items be flex end, like so. Justify will bring it to the left side, align items will bring it to the bottom side. Now, what if I wanted it to be on the bottom right? I'll give you a second to figure that out. If you said we would keep align items at flex end and we would just move justify to flex end as well, then you were correct. Now, let's take a look at how everything works with column as well. If you said that everything would be sort of the same, as in justify controls the X and align item controls the right, well, that's sort of a weird case. As you can see here, if I were to set justify to flex start, what it actually does is it moves all of the cells up. And if I were to set align items to flex start, well, now everything is, now this is controlling the x-axis. So this is what makes Flex sort of hard to understand for a lot of people, and it makes the Material UI grid system a bit hard to use when trying to center items, and a bit frustrating. Because as soon as you go from row to column, things seemingly switch up what they do. Justify starts working the opposite manner, and so does align items. To see why this does that, let's go into code sandbox.io and try playing around with our sandbox here. So as you can see here, I have a basic container, a basic and two basic items inside of here, and each one of these are just some random icons that I pulled off of the Material UI website. So right now, our container, the direction is defaulted to row, which is why these two things are beside each other. Now let's go ahead and experiment with what we already know. If I wanted to center both of these in the middle, well, since it's row, I would just set justify equal to center, and you would see here that we would center them. If I wanted them to be at the end of the container, I would just give it flex end, and if I wanted it to be at the beginning of the container, which is by default, I would give it flex start. There's also space between, if you remember that, and there's also space around, which will give it even spacing between everything. Now, as you can see right now, we're not actually giving any size values to these grid items. So let's move this back to center and see what happens when we actually give this item an excess of 12, which means this item will take up the entire row. Well, as you can see, this first AC unit that is in blue that I gave excess to 12 to actually stops getting centered, while the second one continues getting centered. Now, that's sort of weird, and you might be saying, why does that happen? But if we were to inspect element and look a bit deeper, we can see that because this grid item takes up the entire span of the row, it's already technically being centered. Something that takes up all the space is technically already centered. What center doesn't do is align the items actually inside the actual items itself. For example, this AC unit is going to be wherever is just going to be at the beginning of whatever the grid item is. What was happening before here, if I were to just leave this one AC unit in, what was happening before was this grid item was only taking up a small amount of space. So technically this AC unit was still at the beginning of this grid unit. The grid unit was just so small that it could be centered. If I were to set this grid unit excess to be equal to 3, for example, you would see here that now it's a bit off, because if I look at the entire grid unit, it's still centered, but the actual AC unit is taking up space on the left side. It's being centered on the left side. One way you can do this for icons and text alike is you can give your grid item a style, and usually we would use class name, etc., but just to save time, I'm using style. You can say align text align equal to center, and you'll see here now it will actually center the AC unit within it. And depending on what you have inside of your grid, you're going to center it differently. Usually with anything like an icon or an SVG icon or text or anything like that, you can use text align to center it, but depending on what it is, you'll use different methods of centering. So this is sort of what goes on when we are actually using justify inside of our actual component inside of our actual grid container. Now, let's see what would happen if we use align items here. And let's set this to center as well. Well, now nothing is really happening. And the reason for that is align items will center our things vertically, but the grid item is already sort of taking up as much space as it's going to take up. Therefore, this item, for example, when you align it in center, it's not going to make much of a difference. It's already aligned in the center of the grid item. However, if we were to give this grid container a bit more height, let's say set this height to be something like 400 pixels, you can see here now all of a sudden our centering is taking place. If I were to go ahead and inspect element on this entire grid item, so let's go into, or sorry, the actual container itself. We can see the container itself is a bit larger. And let's make this 100 because I'm a bit zoomed in, so 400 pixels looks a lot bigger than it is. But you'll see here, now all of a sudden the container is this big, and what we're doing is we're aligning everything within the center. Now, if I were to go ahead and uncomment this out, let's remove this stuff from here, and let's go ahead and uncomment this. You would see that they're both side by side in the center. And now if I were to change the direction equal to column, you would see here that because we have justify and align items equals to center, it's still centering both of these items. The only difference is now it's displaying in column versus a row. Now, if you've been paying attention, you should be able to know, for example, if I switch the justify here now that we are in column, well, what's going to happen? Is it going to change the x-axis or the y-axis? If I change this to flex start. Well, let's go ahead and see. You'll see here that it moves everything up to the top and it aligns it as a flex start on the y-axis. And if I were to change this to flex end, you could probably guess that it would move these all to the right side. And that's pretty much how centering things in grid works. It might seem a bit more complicated when you work with more items. What in reality, all it really comes down to is the direction of the parent container and whether or not you want to align and how you want to pretty much align your elements. I really highly recommend, if you're struggling with centering stuff in grid, please take the time to learn how Flexbox works. Like I said, I highly recommend this site, Flexbox Froggy. I'm not affiliated with them. I just found the site today, but I thought it was an amazing resource. And yeah, once again, if you found value in this video, please consider leaving a comment, liking, or subscribing. Let me know if there's any other tutorials you want to see related to Material UI. If there's anything that I didn't cover that you want me to cover, leave a comment and I'll make a video. Like I said, this video was inspired by someone leaving a comment on my last video saying that I should cover this more thoroughly. So thank you again for watching. I hope everyone's staying safe and have an amazing day.